Dear students, we were discussing the sources of ancient Indian political thought. Of these sources, two are most important. The first one is the archaeological sources and the second one is the literary sources. We have already discussed the archaeological sources in detail. Today, we will be discussing the literary sources. Before we begin a detailed discussion of the literary sources, let me tell you that 3 points should be mentioned while discussing the literary sources. First one is that normally we say that history begins with literary sources. Literary sources are regarded as the beginning of the historical period. The second important point is that the problem with ancient Indian literary texts is that most of them they did not mention the time or the year when they were codified. So it is always a problem with respect to finding out the exact time when these literary sources were compiled. Particularly, this is a problem with our Vedic tradition, which were not written or codified during the time when they were compiled. They were codified much later, and from the evidences of other elements associated with the Vedic tradition, scholars have pointed out that they happen to be the earliest literary sources of ancient India. The third important point is that a particular text was not written by a particular person. For instance, if I give you the illustration of Mahabharata, we find that at the initial period there were 800 verses in the Mahabharata, which was not called Mahabharata at that time. It was called Jaya, means the victory in connection with a warfare. Later on, several more verses were added to it. It became Bharata, consisting of 24,000 verses, which indicated that it was a story of a particular tribe or clan called Bharata. While later on, many more verses were added to it and it became Mahabharata, consisting of 100,000 verses. So, the Mahabharata was compiled over a period of time by several authors, although the authorship was particularly attributed to Krishnodvaipayan Vedas, who appeared to be, however, a mythical figure. Now, we will discuss the various literary sources that are connected with ancient Indian political thought. For the convenience of our discussion, these may be categorized under several heads. 1. The Vedic tradition. 2. The Shastra literature or the Shastra tradition. 3. The literary texts. 4. The epics and the Puranas. 5. The semi-biographical texts. 6. Texts on astronomy and astrology. 7. Texts on agriculture and economy. 8. The Jain texts. 9. The Buddhist texts. 10. The texts belonging to the South India or the Deccan, to be precise. And finally, 11. The foreign accounts, that is the accounts given by the foreign travelers. Let me discuss each of these sources in a detailed manner. First, the Vedic tradition. By Vedic tradition, we mean particularly the 4 Vedas, the Rig, the Sama, the Yajur and the Atharva, and the various Upanishads. Now, the Rig Veda is considered to be the first written document belonging to ancient India. It is believed that it was written during the time from 1500 to 1100 BC, and the other Vedas followed the compilation of the Rig Veda. However, it is to be noted that all the Vedas and the Upanishads were primarily spiritual and religious in tradition. They used to give us the kernel of what is later known as the Hindu philosophy or Hinduism. But the social and the political history from which we can create an ancient Indian political thought is not so pronounced in the Vedic tradition, excepting perhaps the Atharva Veda, where various kinds of rituals, sacrifices, that is the yagyas, have been mentioned. From this, we come to know that the kings during that period used to perform various rituals and sacrifices, principally to bring the adjoining territories under his control and to bring welfare and happiness to his subjects. So, apart from the Atharva Veda, the entire Vedic tradition is not so important so far as the social and political history of ancient India is concerned. Perhaps the more important source are the Shastra tradition. By Shastra tradition, we principally mean the three kinds of Shastras. The first one is the Dharma Shastra, the second one is the Artha Shastra, and the third one is the Kama Shastra. By Dharma Shastra, we principally mean the books and the sources which were legal in character or which were legal writings. Dharma Shastras principally consist of two kinds of sources. One is the Dharma Sutras and the second is the Smriti tradition or the Smriti literature, which is believed to be consisting of 18 Smritis written in different periods of time. The Dharma Sutras or the legal writings are very important so far as the concept of justice is concerned, the dispensation of justice, the way justice was delivered by the king, the way legal disputes were brought to the royal court, and the way the people who became guilty or who were found to be guilty received punishments from the kings. So the Dharma Sutras were principal sources so far as the construction of the social and political history of ancient India is concerned. Within the Shastra tradition, that is within the Dharma Shastras, we also include the different Smritis. The earliest of these Smritis was codified by Manu, which is called Manu Smriti. The Manu Smriti is very important so far as the construction of the structured Hindu society is concerned. Manu Smriti gave us different directives or different prescriptions regarding how the people of in ancient India should behave, how they should receive their rights from the monarch, and more importantly, how they should perform their duties towards the king. However, there were also other Smritis written later in the period of time, like the Smriti of Yagyavalka, the Smriti of Brihaspati, the Smriti of Narada, and so on. So, this is principally the Dharma Shastras consisting of the Dharma Sutras on the one hand and the Smriti literature on the other. Within the Shastra tradition, next comes the Artha Shastra. The Artha Shastra of Kautilya is the most important of this tradition. The Artha Shastras in general codify the economic and the trading aspects of the state. But the Kautilyan Artha Shastra is particularly important because it is not a descriptive text in general. It is more a kind of a prescriptive text where the author prescribes something, gives certain sermons to the young prince, the Yuvaraja, so that he could become a very successful king later on. So, the Arthashastra of Kautilya is one of the major sources of the ancient Indian political thought to recreate the economic and the social history of ancient India. Regarding the other Shastra that belongs to the Shastra tradition is the Kama Shastra, which was written much later than the Arthashastra of Kautilya. The Kama Shastra of Vatsayana is the most important of all the Kama Shastras, and it particularly discusses the position of women in society, the role of the subjects in the creation of a society, and so on. Now, let us come to the third source, which is literary texts. By literary texts, we mean those texts which were neither religious in character nor economic or indicating something very important aspect of the statecraft, but they are in general wonderful expressions of literature, and through the reading of these texts we can get an idea of how the society at that time was. Of the literary texts, we can mention the three very important texts of Kalidasa, the Avijnana Sakuntalam, the Meghadutam, and the Raghuvansam. Similarly, we mention the works of Shudraka or the works of Vishakhadatta. We may also include the grammar and the linguistic texts that were developed in that time, particularly the text developed by Panini. So, these constitute the principal literary sources of ancient India. Now, coming to the fourth important literary source, that is the biographical or the semi-biographical texts. By biographical and semi-biographical texts, we mention principally the Harsha Charita written by Banavatta during the later part of the ancient Indian time frame, but from that book we get a wonderful idea of how the state was run by Harsha during his time. So, this is an important biographical or semi-biographical text. Another very important source belonging to this tradition is the Raj Tarangini written by Kalhan. Raj Tarangini principally discusses the activities and the performance of a stream of kings belonging to the Kashmir region. So, this constitutes a very important source of ancient Indian political thought, which is normally not discussed within this area. The next important source is the epics and the Puranas. The epics mean the two very important epics of ancient India, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. The Ramayana is considered to be written a bit earlier than the Mahabharata. Like the Mahabharata that I have discussed already, Ramayana is also not written by any single person. Normally, it is thought that Valmiki has written the Ramayana, but actually it has been found that Valmiki wrote the very important or the basic story of the Ramayana. Others, later on, other scholars added to it, and it became the Ramayana, the epic, by the hands and by the writing skill of all those scholars. Now, through the Ramayana, we get a very clear picture of the victory or the journey of the Aryans over the Dasas or the Dasyus or the non-Aryans during that time. We find that how the Eastern Indian people were depicted in the Ramayana as the Vanaras or the Vanarasenas. That means that they did not belong to the Aryan tradition. Likewise, people living at that time at Lanka or the southern part of India also did not belong to the Aryan culture or the Aryan civilization. So it is principally a story of the victorious march of Rama, who belonged to the Aryan tradition and civilization over the Dasas or the Dasyus or the non-Aryans. At the same time, we get a picture of the position or the role of the woman that they had during that period. So Ramayana gives us a wonderful expression of the society from which we could very well recreate the social, economic and political history of ancient India. The next important epic is the Mahabharata, which I have already told is not the work of a single person, but a compilation of many scholars contributing to the development of this great and grand epic. However, it should be mentioned that Mahabharata can be analyzed from several perspectives. While on the one hand, it denotes the war or the major kinds of warfare that were going on during that period between two rival groups belonging to the same kinship tradition. At the same time, Mahabharata gives us a kernel of the Hindu philosophy, which is written in a part of the Mahabharata called the Srimad Bhagavad Gita. So we get various aspects from the epic Mahabharata. Apart from the epics, the Puranas also used to give us various aspects of ancient Indian political thought, and the Puranas, like the Smriti literature, are considered to be consisting of 18 parts, or there are 18 Puranas from which we used to get different dimensions of the ancient Indian society. Next, we come to the texts on astronomy and astrology. Surprisingly, we find that the astronomical science, although maybe in its very rudimentary form, was present in ancient Indian political thought. The greatest illustration of this is the writings of Varaha Mihira, who gave us a total cosmological understanding, and from that we know that people even during that time had a kind of understanding with the planet Earth, with the sun, which was their principal god of worship, which they called Vivaswan or Bhaskara. But from an overall understanding, we find that the astronomical aspects of the knowledge was quite present to the people even at that time. Next comes the source on agriculture and the economic aspects. The agriculture and the economic aspects can be found from the books like Krishi Parashara, which was written a bit later during the later part of the ancient period, almost touching the Middle Age, but still we find that people during the 8th and 9th century AD were quite competent to develop a very advanced kind of agriculture, which definitely gave a boost to the economic resources of their state, of their polity, and of their existence. We may now turn to the literature of the South or the Deccan. Principally, the Sangama literature constitute the literature of the South. Actually, within the Tamil region during the ancient period, there were several assemblies of poets which were referred to as the Sangama assemblies, and from those assemblies, the poets, they used to give their commentaries on the statecraft, on the polity, on the economy, and on the social fabric, particularly of the Tamil region, or the region which we call the Dakshinatya or the Deccan. So this constitutes the literature of the Deccan. Next comes the Jain tradition. Now we all know that Jainism evolved in India, criticizing the Varnashram dharma of ancient India, which again was derived from the Vedic tradition. The Jainas, they criticized the severe casteism and the social stratification that Indian society had during that time. So the Jaina texts revealed these things, and they mentioned that how the society could come out from those strict casteist scriptures by following the teachings and the preachings of Lord Mahavira. The most important Jaina texts are called the Agama literature, and within these texts we find various kinds of informations, not only religious or prescriptive, but about the condition of the people who were downtrodden, in the sense that who belonged to the lowest strata of the caste hierarchy, who were the untouchables, the kind of treatment that the upper castes or the upper varnas they used to give to them, and the kinds of political structure that was developed around this social stratification or around this very strict casteist structure. Now next comes the Buddhist tradition or the Buddhist literatures. By Buddhist tradition, we mean the texts and the literature that evolved out of the preachings of Buddha and Buddhism. As we all know that like Jainism, Buddhism also evolved to eradicate the social evils and the strict casteist social stratification that were in fact inherent in the Vedic tradition. So Buddhism appealed to the common people and had a quality of equality that it wanted to prescribe to all. Here it should be mentioned that in the Vedas we find the Sanskrit language, which is in fact called the Devabhasha, meaning thereby that it was spoken, written, and followed by the people belonging to the upper stratum of the society, that is the Brahmanas mostly, and the Kshatriyas and the Vaishyas to an extent. So when Jainism and Buddhism later on challenged the Vedic principles and recommendations, they also thought that Sanskrit should not be followed in their preachings. So they in fact started to document their preachings and teachings in Prakrit and in Pali. The Jain texts were mostly written in Prakrit, while the Buddhist texts were mostly written in Pali. The Buddhist texts were basically three in number: the Sutta Pitaka, the Vinaya Pitaka, and the Abhidhamma Pitaka. The Sutta Pitaka consisted of the preachings and teachings of Buddha. The Vinaya Pitaka consisted of the rules and regulations that were to be followed by the monks who became an important part of Buddhism. And finally, the Abhidhamma Pitaka consisted of ideals and principles that were to be followed by the common people. Now, within the Sutta Pitaka, two Pitakas are most important. One is the Dighanayaka and the other is the Khuddaka Nayaka. Now, the Dighanayaka talks about the economic and the trading aspects of the people engaged in that time. So, from Dighanayaka, we get an idea of the economic and social history of that time. On the other hand, the Khuddaka Nayaka, that in fact consisted of the Jatakas or the Jataka stories, which consisted or constituted an important aspect of Buddhism as a spiritual philosophy. Now, finally, we come to the accounts of the foreign travelers, which is normally described as the foreign accounts within these literary sources. Now, of these foreign accounts, the most important are basically three. One is the account of Megasthenes, who visited the court of Alexander at that time, and his writings, we know it is the Indica, and from there we get to know the picture of India belonging to that particular time, that is the something around the pre-Mauryan, early Mauryan period. On the other hand, the two other major foreign accounts came a bit later. One is that of Fahian, the early 5th century AD, and the other is the writings of Huensang belonging to the 7th century AD. So these foreign accounts help a lot in constructing and reconstructing ancient India for two very important reasons. One is that they were not written from within, that is, they were not written by Indians who might have some kind of bias in their writings, but these foreign travelers with a distant eye, that is from outside, have written India, which we may call to an extent an authentic representation. And the second is that these accounts or these travelogues were not confined to a very particular region or within a very narrow region. They encompassed a large region, and from that we get to know the various activities belonging to ancient India and spreading over a comparatively large area. So these all constitute the literary sources of ancient Indian political thought.